Good evening. On our live broadcast tonight, you've just seen two world premieres. The first formal concert by the Nashville Symphony in the new Schermerhorn Symphony Center, and the first ever performance of the Concerto for Bass, Banjo, and Tabla by Edgar, Meyer, Bela Fleck, and Zakir Hussain. I'm Craig Havighurst, music reporter for Nashville Public Radio, and welcome to our post-concert conversation with the composers and artists of that piece. Edgar, Bela, Zakir, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I thought I'd just dive right in and talk about the piece. If I could get each of you in turn to give a sort of big picture description of what this piece is, what people might compare it to, and what, if there was a conceptual idea behind it, what that is.
Well, to me, and my perception of it is being the three of us, that, and I've always flashed on the idea that the seven notes, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, are the same in India, the same in China and Korea and Indonesia or Japan or anywhere. And so I've always wondered if there is one place that we've all appeared from or come from. And so the piece to me kind of points to that beginning and that origin, us being maybe brothers who had our ancestral connection somewhere way back when in the same spot, and then we all went away and to our different destinies, and then suddenly we run into each other, and then we start talking to each other and find that that there are certain similarities that we have, and those connections start appearing and magnifying, and to me the piece kind of represents that kind of origin and reappearance and rediscovery of our roots.
Bela, you thought it through in the same way?
Wow. That was beautiful.
Well, I'm glad you agree.
That's very nice.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. I thought of it all by myself.
I showed up, I brought my banjo to the writing sessions, threw in some ideas, and just watched the whole thing happen, just from everybody's ideas. And for me, the music is very evocative to me, but I wouldn't give it as direct a concept. It's just sort of, it is a real strong musical, the character of the three of us put into one piece, and the things that we were able to derive by the things that we pulled out of each other that wouldn't normally happen. Like Edgar and I notice a lot of times when we write together, we write things that we wouldn't have written separately. Things happen like that, and with three people, never having done that before, a lot of really interesting things happen.
Oh yeah. Musically.
So.
And formally, Edgar, did you know it would have three movements from the beginning, that the concerto form had something that gave you a structure or architecture?
Well, the concerto form is not so much the point as the fact that, that you're going to play for about 25 minutes, and, as Stefan Grappelli said, you want to start well and you want to end well. And so that usually means quicker tempos on the outside, and you want to play some slow music, so that probably goes in the middle. So, I mean, it's not, there could be other ways to do it, and if you look carefully, the first movement does have slow music in the middle, and there is some slightly fast music in the middle of the slow movement, and we also mean to play the piece almost without pause, so it's almost like one big movement. So we want it to be a continuous thought.
Yeah, for me, it's a difficult thing to get used to, because in India, when you play music, the slow music is always in the beginning. And then you play the slow music, and you slowly develop the scales and the rhythms, and gradually speed up until you reach a final crescendo an hour and a half later in one piece. And so it's interesting to see that the way the movements flow in a concerto form is that you do have the faster movements beginning the piece, and then you slow down. So it's like you have to come to the stage all warmed up and ready to go. While in Indian music, you come to the stage cold and warm up along with the audience how it's going. I don't know if it's the same with the way flat tones play and all that stuff, Bill.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's more of maybe it's a showbiz aspect or something, but you want to come out and hit them hard and then open up. Generally we try to come out with something very strong, and usually, you got to be warmed up and ready. So that is different.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, we'll talk more about the piece in a moment, but I wanted to back up and give a bit of sense of background of the three of you. We couldn't touch the biographies of your lives in the half an hour we have, but it struck me that each of you have made reputations, worldwide reputations, making very innovative music on very old and familiar instruments. Bela, the banjo goes back hundreds of years. It's been in American music, American roots music for hundreds of years. And you started in bluegrass, the traditional way, I guess you'd call it, of playing the banjo, and taken it into jazz and funk. And you have a Bela Fleck and the Flecktones group, which is almost no holds barred musically. But I know you've known and worked with Edgar a long time, and instead of putting you on the spot, I'd love to ask Edgar, what's your quick take on Bela as a musician, his diversity and his strengths? What have you admired about him over the years?
He's good looking. I think with Bela, native intelligence and tenacity. He finds a way to make things work. You can throw him into a situation and it might not make any sense, and you give him half an hour and it'll start to be something. And also, I think the banjo has provided a unique prism through which he views the world, and a way of understanding rhythm and understanding melody that is unique to him, and maybe makes almost more sense to a banjo player, or makes more sense to me now that I've spent so much time with the two of us.
Mm-hmm. Did it surprise? Going back to the beginning, had you ever worked with a banjo player before? Did it surprise you, and you're a classically trained musician, that the banjo worked in those settings and worked in a semi-classical or classical setting?
No, it never surprised me. Obviously, from knowing Bela from the very beginning, always had a beautiful sound and a very refined approach on the instrument, which would just naturally work in a variety of settings. I think for a long time, it may have taken me many years to understand that it was not a guitar and that it was not a mandolin, and that and just the unique personality.
That it had its own vocabulary, right?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll turn the tables and Bela, ask you to talk a little bit about Edgar, someone who began playing the bass at age 5, and your dad trained you, and you went the conservatory route, and you've composed for bass and cello, bass and string quartets, played with some of the great ensembles in the concert halls in America and the world. What have you observed about what it is he does so well?
Edgar's really good at being Edgar. I mean, he's got his own way with the melody, he's got his own way with everything, but from the very beginning when I first heard him, there was something unique and wonderful. It was always wonderful. I couldn't exactly tell you why, but there was something about the way he would phrase, or the way he would, a lot of intensity, like just simply as a player, the way he plays the bass as a very vocal quality, and inspired by a lot of people that maybe aren't bass players, like Stevie Wonder, or people like Tim O'Brien, people that from different worlds and that use voices. He was coming from that, but then after getting to know him as a player and just being very excited to play with him and hear him, I got to know him as a composer, and it just blew me away what he was doing, the different ideas that he was able to develop as a composer with the instrument out of his hands. And he's just an inspiring guy. And when I listen to a lot of different people out there, there's just nobody who does it like Edgar. And it's just a variety of influences and a variety of things, and it's hard to put it into words exactly what it is, but it's very valuable.
Well, certainly having brought the bass, I imagine, out as a solo instrument more. I think we're more comfortable now in the world thinking of the bass as a front instrument.
It's not just that. It's more of a character thing. It's more of like I get the impression that Edgar knew very early on how he wanted to sound, and did it despite what other people thought. Like a lot of attitude about and confidence in his own view of how he should go after it.
Oh, yeah,
which
that's true.
I really like. I really like that. I like this iconoclastic. And yet the other thing is that he's so well versed in composition, and the people that inspire him in composition that he studied, and it gives him a background and a way to grow his own music from roots that are so deep and thoughtful. There's a very intellectual aspect, but he doesn't get caught by that. There's an emotional quality too. So it's a lot of things altogether.
And Zakir, you also play your father's instrument, I think, right?
Yes, I do. Yes.
When did you know that was going to be your destiny? And describe a little bit about the world in which you grew up and began to study.
Well, I grew up playing Indian classical music, and this music goes back more than 3,000 years and is still being played in its classical form, in its original form in India, and everywhere else in the world. Indian classical music musicians perform. But I studied with my father playing tabla, and I don't know when I decided that it was it. It was always it. It never was something that I was going to discard at a certain time in my life. I always felt that tabla was my twin brother. It was going to always be with me. I played with it. That was my toy. And I was already a professional musician without having decided that this is where I was going to be and make my living as a tabla player. And so when I arrived in America, when I was 18 years old, and then I had to pay my rent, that's when I said, oh, okay, so I'm a professional musician, and now I have to look at it as a source of my income so that I can take care of myself. In India, being a joint family, you all live together, and you never had to worry about being a professional person having to take care of the usual daily routines. So it was something that I grew right into it, and have always been since the age of maybe 3 or 4. My father, when I first came in, was brought home from the hospital, would speak rhythms in my ear when he held me as a baby. And that was a routine that he followed for an hour or two every day. So by the time I was 3 or 4 years old, I was already playing it.
Yes, I have heard that one of the ways you would learn some of the more complicated polyrhythms is using a syllable. Can you give it a little, just an example of that?
Yeah, I could, but it would not allow me. But Katan said it's okay, so so yes, it's all part of having spoken language. If I was to ask a question, where have you been all this time? So it's like that, and
you
the
play
language.
that question on the tabla.
And then you play the question on the tabla, so your expression would have to be exactly the way you've spoken it. So it's almost like you putting yourself in it, and that's one thing that I enjoyed with Bela and Edgar is that emotional content into the music, even though there were time issues and it has to be 25 minutes or it has to be this or that. It was important to see that what they were feeling, what their thinking was at that moment expressed itself in the music. And when I arrived to play with people like, with Edgar, and I thought, okay, Western classical music, so it's going to be on a piece of paper and it's going to be that. But it wasn't like that. It was playing with them and seeing their personalities emerge in the music. And that's exactly what it is in Indian music, because it's an improvised form of music. So you make the music your own. And when you perform the music as you see it, as you feel it, and you express it at that moment the way it's coming to you. So that connection was there.
I'd love to explain the tabla for one moment, and I hope the audience saw it in the last couple of hours, but there are always 2 drums, a pair of drums, and you play with your wrists, your fingers, your palms.
Yeah.
And the thing that struck me watching you in rehearsal was that this is an instrument that is not just about rhythm, it is also about melody, and you are playing melody right along with these guys.
Yes, and what's interesting to me is that banjo is also not about melody alone, it's also about rhythm as well as bass. So that is one thing that we have in common with each other, that we are all playing instruments which have emphasis on rhythm but also on melody, or vice versa. So the instrument is only about 300 odd years old, so it's a young instrument in the fold of Indian classical music. But one thing about tabla which is unusual, is that it has, unlike any other drum, within the 2 drums that it has, which are together known as a set of tabla, it has tone retention, resonance, and also melodic possibilities, harmonic possibilities. So on the bass drum, you can actually play like a walking bass and play all the 7 notes of the scale, while the right-hand drum acts like a drum kit situation where there's a snare and tom-toms and all that, and it's being played that way. And the bass drum is like a bass, but with tonal things in it. And as you already know, that there is a language to it. So each finger is assigned a particular tone or a particular sound, like na, ti, ne, stuff like that, or g, g, and you combine those together to create the language of the tabla.
It was striking watching you play how the two of you are both very focused on the tips of your fingers and accented rhythms, and what you were doing on your strings on your drum head of the banjo and your drum head without the strings is so very similar, and the accented rhythms, the accented notes.
I have to say
matter a
it
lot.
felt pretty remarkable the first time we started to play together. It was just like, and that's what goes back to your brotherhood thing, idea for the whole piece, is that it did feel like we were people coming back together playing again rather than the first time. It was so comfortable to lock fast notes together. It just happened very, very nicely. So.
Well, let's go back to the origins of this piece. Who would like to tell the story of how this piece came to be? I think it was a commission, and if you could describe how it began.
Well, Bela and I did a piece with the orchestra a couple years ago that we wrote together, and we played together with the orchestra with Kenneth Schermerhorn, and we had a wonderful experience doing that. And Kenneth and Alan Valentine approached us and said, "We'd like you to do this again, and we'd like you to have a third person." And
It wasn't exactly quite like that.
what?
You guys said that you would do it if you had, information.
We were concerned about doing it again so soon.
Yes.
We're like, well, how could we make this different? And so we said, this would really be interesting if, and we made a list of people that we would think it would be basically impossible for us to refuse.
And I was on the bottom of the list, so they kept ticking off, okay, no.
And also,
you were the top guy on that list. And,
he also was one of the few guys who actually intersected both of our lists.
and also he needed work.
That's
which was
right.
Yeah,
another
I
issue.
really need to work at that.
No, he was the top of our list. He was the guy
one
we both
person that
agreed on.
We were both just
would-
very, very excited to have a
crazy
chance
to
to
do
get to
it, yeah.
meet and get to play with.
Yeah.
And they got the Schermerhorn department to agree on me being a part of it. So I have to thank you for allowing me to have this opportunity, because it really is, having, run all around the globe and then finally met, your siblings. So it's a great.
Did you
thing.
get together with a blank score and start from scratch, all three of you together in a room?
In a sense, yes. I mean, one of the things that we did was take notes of whatever we talk about, because writing a piece, I think brainstorming can be pretty useful, and so just making notes of both musical ideas. Of course, we sat down and played together, but we met at Zakir's house the first time, and Bela and I had both finished 2 different tours in San Francisco on the same day, which was really kind of unusual. And so we took the next day.
Stayed an extra day and met. And just basically, I think one of the things, since we knew that a lot of time would be spent in Nashville with mostly Edgar and sometimes me working on fleshing this thing out, was to get a lot of Zakir's input every time we could get together with him. So we started basically trolling for melodies and ideas and taping them all, writing a lot of them down as possible things. So we did this a few times until we gathered a large list of musical motifs that we could consider, and gradually moved towards several that we thought would go really well together. And then we started fleshing it out, and we just kept checking in, getting back together.
Yeah, but it was always a dialogue, and I actually more and more value the part of the process where you just literally put ideas together, try to figure out what the piece will be in advance without sitting down and writing it and figuring it all out. But just to think about, it'd be nice if a couple minutes in something like this happened, or the idea of the piece should be X, or
We actually made a list of, this was my idea about a list of events that should happen somewhere in the piece. Somewhere the tabla and the bass should play, somewhere the banjo and the tabla should play, somewhere the banjo and the bass should play. Each of us should have a moment that was pretty much solo. Things like that. That we kept track of as we went along. Well, what would be a good place for that to happen?
I know you all are used to playing, and you, as you said, a lot of improvised music. How much improvisation did you build into this?
None for me.
Okay.
Well, the last piece, we built in a little bit of improvisation. I had an improvised section.
Zakir improvises his cadenza in the first movement.
Yeah.
And but the one thing that's nice though is that with both Bela and Zakir, Zakir is very comfortable playing totally improvised music, but I think there's a large part of the traditions that you grew up in where the pieces are played note for note.
Yep.
And you're very comfortable with that too.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
There's a lot of traditional repertoire that has been written for tabla as a solo instrument. And so we have fixed compositions that we play, so the music is not all totally improvised. There are certain sections of the music which are also fixed. So that conditioning of being able to play music as prescribed already, note to note, written out, does also exist in Indian music. So in that sense, it was possible to, for us to agree on a certain idea of write a piece of music, and for me to adhere to that, ask, whatever that was. But the gentlemen here have allowed me to have my say, so I do tweak it as we are playing. So every day there is a little difference in, and it's the same with their music. Even when Edgar plays his cadenza, there is a different way of approaching the note, and some days it feels different, and some days it's the same as yesterday. So in that sense, there is an adjustment and an improv, but mostly we have been kind of sticking to what the piece requires, and I open up a little bit when my cadenza is there.
Right. Did you, hearing the piece, one does hear American sounding, sort of that full, almost Aaron Copland, something about the harmonies, and something of an Indian influence that goes beyond merely the fact of the tabla being there and playing tabla.
Right.
What did you think about that?
Well, I think part of that comes from how we got a lot of the materials. Like, for instance, once we had a melody idea and a concept, I knew we decided a lot of it was going to be in 11. And then we started asking Zakir for a large number of rhythmic compositions in 11 that, and these rhythmic compositions, they really have shapes to them, harmonic shapes. And then our job that Edgar and I did was take those shapes and try and write music, Western music to them, or what kind of to call it. Sometimes we stuck within a certain scale pattern or raga pattern. Sometimes we broke out of it, but mostly, in every case, we kept every aspect of the original composition rhythmically and followed the shapes that were. Look, it was kind of like sculptors say that when they're chipping at the stone, that they're finding something that's already there, and it was kind of like that because we had these rhythms and we had these shapes, and yet we had to pull out what sounded like our music in there too, our lines and so on.
Well, I was going to ask about the time signatures in this piece because there are some crazy, hard to count rhythmic passages. You all are used to working in outside of the 4/4 standard count.
I pity the audience.
Well, what advice would you give an audience to? Yeah, an audience almost has to let go of that feeling, the need to count to 4 each beat.
It's not a piece you can count the first time you hear it. It'd be a lot of fun if you could listen to it 5 or 6 times and start to pick it up. But I think I'm hoping that it will work for people without that. That can just flow by you and you can just accept it.
And also, I would say, backtracking on the organization of the piece, there's not. Even though there is a harmonic direction from the beginning of the piece to the end of the piece, most of the local areas are modal. In that sense, they would fit on a rag or.
Yeah, because we've used certain ragas like Bhairavi and Puriya, and these are old traditional ragas that come from India.
And are ragas a melodic idea or a rhythmic idea?
It's a melodic scale.
Okay.
That is a prescribed scale for a particular. A composed scale based on parental scale ideas. In India, we have 10 thoughts, which are the 10 parent scales, on which most of the raga scales are based. So each thought or each parent would have, say, 72 ragas assigned to it, which are the combination of the notes from that parent scale. So Bhairavi is one thought, a parent scale, while Puriya is another thought, another parent scale.
And you're saying that these relate somewhat to what we know as modes in Western music.
Well, they relate very strongly.
One of the confusing things for me when I went to India, and as I've tried to understand Indian music, is the problem with modes versus ragas or rags, however you say it, is that it seems like with some rags, when you go up, it's one series of notes, but when you come back down, you come down with different notes.
Well, it's a little more complicated than simply a set of notes.
Right, so it's not just simply a mode where, unless we have modes or jazz scales or whatever you want to call them, where you go up and come back down different ways.
And this is why you studied for
ragas
years and years.
is, I mean, even if you have 5, 6 notes in a raga scale, you may omit one on the way up, and you may add the 6th note on the way down. You may emphasize a particular note, and that would give the face of the raga a little more recognition. And stuff like that, which makes it different. And one problem with raga is that when you harmonize and you put harmonies to a particular set of raga scales, you will eventually run into a situation whereby you may have to use other notes than the ones assigned to the raga. So then you will be messing with what the raga prescribes. So that's what he's talking about when he says that we've tried to keep it more modal so that we don't step too far away from the raga.
But the different modes that were used and the order in which they were used is carefully conceived in order to give it a harmonic direction.
Right.
And then also within the mode, sometimes something I learned hearing Zakir when he'd play with El Shankar sometimes was a way to use the modes and imply harmonies that, that seemed to me a relatively modern thing. So,
We didn't want to just follow the strict Indian rules. We wanted to do a combination.
and there are some times that it is actually harmonic too. I mean, and then I'll add on the western eastern front is that even if Zakir, although a big part of Zakir's background is purely Indian, I would say a lot of melodies you would write have a western component.
Yeah, it does have that. I mean, in India, we have this thing called Bollywood, which is a whole film world, which has been so much inspired from the Western Hollywood system. And so I grew up playing in the orchestra of the films, Bollywood films. So there you would have the whole string section and the horn section and everything on one side of the room, and the other side of the room you'll have sitars and sarods and Indian tablas and folk drums and everything, and all playing together. So since I was 12, I was doing that. So in that way, I became familiar with the Western system of notation and writing music.
In the few minutes we have left, I'd love to ask about what this felt like to roll it out on a stage, play it with an orchestra for the first time, and especially the impact of Leonard Slatkin, the guest conductor for this performance, and what he brought to the shaping, the final shaping. Go for it.
He brings intelligence and overview. He's able to quickly assess a lot of things. He can assess flow issues, whether, which sometimes, for example, the ending of the slow movement had a gesture which we had conceived. Actually, I think it's actually Zakir's idea, but we all kind of talked about it and formed it, where the whole orchestra comes in after we finish, and then they kind of evaporate down to one person. And it wasn't quite working as well as it should, and he just immediately saw it, and it gave, and he might look at another tutti and see that, well, this one section needs to come up a little bit in order to give it a little shape, or he hears balances very quickly and accurately, and so it's just very helpful. And also the orchestra likes him very much, and so there's a connect that's possible, that helps.
And just finally, what does it feel like to play this in Nashville for an event like the opening of this hall, which I hope you responded to well as an acoustic space and a performance space? You two live here, and it must feel like not a coming home, but a birth of something important.
It's a big deal. So it's fun to be in the inside of something like this and watching it all happen from the center. Which is a real privilege to get to do that. We just walk in and work on our music, and because of it, we get to see this incredible hall become completed and the whole big event that's getting
it's a great honor and a privilege to be part
very
of
much
this
is.
new beginning for Schermerhorn, and for us to have been a part of it. I mean, I have to say thanks to the administration for allowing us to be a part of this incredible event. And also, I think it's a great test for the hall acoustically to be, usually halls are made with Western instruments in mind. And then you've got the banjo, which also is not necessarily an orchestral instrument, and tabla.
Right.
So to fit that in, it's amazing.
Well, I know that the audience appreciated it. We appreciated your time today, and I hope the piece has a long life and you get to play it all over the world. It's
thank
marvelous,
you.
marvelous piece of
Thanks.
music. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Craig Havighurst. Good night.